There was a recent study by LinkedIn that started to look at, as more traditional roles declined within journalism and media as a whole, looking at where new roles were sort of starting to pop up. And I think there are a lot of different opportunities now for people in journalism, but in sort of journalism adjacent roles, I guess. So I guess you would call my role journalism adjacent.
Hello, and welcome to Freelance Pod. My name's Suchandrika Chakrabarti, and I'll be your host. Freelance Pod is all about how the internet has revolutionised work. Each week, I'll speak to someone working in a creative field and ask them how their industry has moved from an analogue to a digital age, or how the internet has invented their job. If you like what we're talking about in the podcast, please do get involved on social. You can find Freelance Pod on Instagram as @freelancepod, on Twitter as @freelance_pod_. There's a Facebook group called Freelance Pod, and you can also sign up for the newsletter. The URL is in the show notes. Don't forget that the success of this podcast relies on you, the listeners. If you do enjoy it, please do rate, review and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, also known as iTunes. This means that other listeners will find out that this podcast exists and they'll come and join us too. So welcome to the second part of my interview with Twitter's Director for Curation, Joanna Geary. Back in the first episode, which is worth having a listen to before this one, I'd say, I spoke to Joanna about her career in reporting and working on newspapers, starting with the Birmingham Post and then going over to the Times and the Guardian, which are rapidly becoming digital. She also set up the London chapter of Hacks Hackers, which is where journalists and developers get to meet each other and talk. And moving over to Twitter was, as she will say on this episode, a way of her getting to advocate for journalism in a tech setting as opposed to advocating for tech in a journalism setting. And she also gets to see inside all of the newsrooms within the UK, or certainly her first role at Twitter allowed her to do that. And that was part of the reason why she left a newsroom, which was tough for her, and moved over to a tech company. And Joanna also has some tips if you're thinking of doing the same thing at the end of the episode. So here she is. And yes, if you've not listened to part one, that was last week's episode, do go and have a listen. And then, we'll go with Joanna from her years at The Guardian, from 2013 onwards to Twitter and the present day.
I caveat this with, I've only really gone through one major structural change in my career, this move to digital. But I think there's sort of two phases that really stand out within that change. And one is when you have early adopters and you start getting this sort of euphoric idealism towards the new technology and the possibilities of what can be presented by this new technology. And that is an incredibly seductive, incredibly exciting time to be in a group of people during great change. And what comes out of that is usually very, very rapid experimentation, lots of picking some things up, looking at them, dropping them again, picking something else up, having a go with it. And then I think there becomes a period of time as technology starts to become more familiar, where you sort of go through the difficult teenage years, where you're then sort of asking yourself, how valuable is this really? How much can this be used in the sort of idealistic way that we were hoping it could be used? What is the actual implementation of this? How hard is it going to be? And I think it's fair to say that the answer for many of these things is very hard indeed. And then you're going on this journey from something that's just this incredibly new, exciting, just discovered thing to being something that you're moving towards a kind of more mass adoption in terms of society, and being able to figure out how that changes things and what you want, what you're hoping the end goal can be, if that makes sense. And it's a different sort of skill set, and it's a little bit more gritty, and it's a little bit tougher in a way, I think. And I think being able to learn that you're moving from one to the other is really important. And I noticed that switch happening while I was at the Times and the Guardian. And sometimes I noted that I was trying to switch, but it made me so dull compared to that very exciting, experimental, sparky time, that it was difficult to bring people along with me. And learning how to bring people with you when what you're kind of saying is, okay, now we need to do the grown-up thing and figure out not just like how we can do the fun, sparkly stuff related to this, but actually how we make it work, kind of a business or a production or a process. Like learning how to bring people along with you on that journey, that's a key element of the change that I think has been important for me to focus on and to learn. I wouldn't say I'm perfect at it, but like if you're going to be in any way leading through change, you need to have some sort of concept of how to do it. And I think as well, and when I say we, I mean like the news industry, it is sort of run by FOMO, right? We're constantly, if you've been a journalist, you've been a journalist because you want to know what's going on and you don't want to be missing out on things. And I think when the pace of change is this fast, it's so easy to sort of like go, well, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? What's the next thing? Without actually trying to figure out what good these things actually are for audiences. Like, what do they actually do? And how does it help? And how does it hinder? Where in our storytelling is this actually useful? And I think, that's still a thing we're working out. But I think it definitely takes a different mindset to the mindset that perhaps I had when I was back experimenting things, which was just a much freer, like, we have no idea, we're just going to give it a go, see what happens. So I do think we've moved into a different era in that respect. So as social and community editor of The Guardian, which had responsibility for the community coordinators who sat with the editorial desk and the moderating team. And I mean, when I joined The Guardian, I didn't join The Guardian in that role. It was sort of a role that sort of evolved through various different reasons. But I had pretty much reached one of those points that I talked about earlier where I'm like, well, there is literally nowhere else to go. This is my job. This is what I get to do. I'm really, I was excited. I was very challenged in the role. Like, I had tons of plans and things that I wanted to achieve. And so when I got this, actually a LinkedIn email from Twitter, asking, would I be interested in a partnerships role, I dismissed it. I was flattered enough to mention it to my then boyfriend, and said, isn't that cool? They might be interested, but I had no instinct to follow up on it. Sorry, Twitter. Thankfully, my boyfriend turned around and said, "What are you doing? Why are you thinking that you just reject this out of hand? Like, you don't have a company that's as interesting as that approach you and not at least talk to them." Which was pretty good advice. If you have an interesting company approach you, even if you don't think you're going to take the job, to go talk to them. I can thoroughly recommend that. And I think as I started to talk to them about the role, I started to realize what a really interesting potential next step it was for me. And while I hadn't felt ready to take a new step, I could see that I wouldn't have very many opportunities to see across and into every newsroom in the UK. And that was something that the partnerships role at Twitter offered. It was like an MBA in like newsrooms. I could go in, I could ask questions, I could find out more about what people were doing. And where I was always kind of in my like isolated bubble of like the one publication, whether it was the Times or the Guardian. And that started to sound really exciting to me. And I realized that why I rejected it out of hand was because Twitter wasn't a news organization. And I had so firmly embedded working in news as part of my identity, that I couldn't imagine stepping out of somewhere that didn't have the classic sense of a newsroom. In fact, I was scared of it. I was scared of not thinking that I could call myself a journalist anymore. I was scared of how other people might judge me. And I thought of it as like a one-way ticket out of the thing that I had spent all my life trying to become. And so I ended up realizing that I needed to, as I kept talking to Twitter, realizing how excited I was about the role, I needed to sit down and do a for and against sort of piece of paper on like why I would take the job and why I wouldn't. And what came out was the only thing on the why I wouldn't was that fear of judgment of leaving a newsroom. Now, I hadn't worked as a reporter at that stage. I mean, we're talking 2013. I probably hadn't worked as a traditional reporter for about 5 years at that point. So the idea that the only thing that was keeping me was walking into a place that traditionally called themselves a news org and that had something that was traditionally called a newsroom, it didn't seem strong enough for me not to move. And so I realized that I had to kind of just tackle that fear of judgment and tackle that fear of moving into something that was journalism adjacent, and do it. And very luckily, I got the job, and very luckily, I had a sensible boyfriend, now husband, who got me to reconsider my position, and I took it. And I have not regretted it one single second. It's absolutely been the right thing to do. So I joined Twitter in 2013. And around just after the election in 2015, I was approached by one of my colleagues in the US asking if I knew anyone who could take on this really interesting new role on a project that was codenamed Project Lightning within Twitter. So it was pretty much sold as, we need better discovery on Twitter, and we need to have a way to help people make sense of some of the biggest conversations that are going on, especially around conversations that they may not necessarily find out about through their own home timeline. And so the idea was we wanted to create a product that had a different visual experience, and a different functionality that allowed people to either sort of catch up with something or be made aware of something that they might not have found out about otherwise that was on the platform, or follow along with something as it was happening. And so there had been a sort of investigation on how best to do that, and it was decided that it needed a combination of algorithmic work, but also human curation. And I was approached saying, do you want to get involved in building out the human curation side of this? Which, the more I looked into it, the more I thought about it, the more excited I was about it, because it was just not something that Twitter had historically had any sort of background in, and didn't necessarily have a strong vision for how it was going to look. So there was a real opportunity to start again from the ground up on a project, which I hadn't really had that experience for a little while at that point. And that was really exciting. Also, the opportunity was to build teams. So the role that was presented to me was a EMEA lead, which meant I had the opportunity to build out teams focused on the UK, but in other languages as well. With a second, with some Spanish focus for the second team, and then a Middle East, North Africa team focused on Arabic language. So again, out of my comfort zone, but something really exciting and new, and very clearly at a cross section between technology and media. which felt like a comfortable and exciting home for me. So the way I would look at it these days is Moments is one of the many product surfaces that the curation team touches as part of their work. It's one of the most important and highly visual, but it's not the only one. So the way I would see curation today is we're a particular function within the Twitter product. And we're there to act as a bridge between what we can do, what we can do algorithmically in terms of curation, and what customers are expecting the product to be able to present to them. So a good example of that is we might be able to do really great discovery of some of the big conversations that are bubbling up on the platform, but it might not be so easy to algorithmically detect the most contextual and substantive explaining tweets that exist as part of that conversation. So if you want to showcase what's happening to people and help explain, I don't know, a trend such as covfefe, how do you find the right tweets to explain covfefe? And that's where my team comes in. And so we're able to overlay context onto what's already being sort of elevated and discovered via algorithms. Often what you find when lots of change is happening very quickly, especially in technology, is that the people that are advocating for it are often young. And certainly what was interesting about social media was there was quite a lot of young women who were in those positions. And they haven't necessarily held positions within the newsroom that would typically garner the respect of a newsroom in terms of, experience and reporting. And so it was difficult, I think, to make your voice heard. You were often kind of supported by management, but that doesn't necessarily make your life easier in all situations. In fact, sometimes it can make your life harder if you're parachuted in by senior management as a young professional to talk about all the changes that they want the newsroom to embody. So I definitely wouldn't say it was the easiest role. And I think, as other people have probably told you, when you're in those sorts of positions, it's the people that understand what you're trying to achieve and support you, or are just excited to experiment, that become incredibly valuable people for you to know. And you hold on to them very tightly because they become the advocates and the champions within the groups of people that perhaps traditionally you wouldn't have been able to influence just because of who you are, what your background is. So I do think that made for a really interesting dynamic. I think I often blame myself for not being able to affect change that actually I was placing too much responsibility on myself to do. You can only advocate so far. And there were just always going to be people that weren't necessarily interested. And I think another thing is your ability to influence is sort of tied into your ability to present a winning formula to people. So that's difficult when what you're trying to talk about is a new area where ultimately a lot of it is experimental. So interestingly, I think let's talk about Twitter. It's something I knew a lot about. I think the things really started taking off in 2009 around Twitter. And that wasn't because there was no one in newsrooms making the case for using it. Before that, there were people in 2007 and 2008. But what happened in 2009 was that a number of people who were in more traditional roles within newsrooms started to find benefit in being on the platform, and seeing it as a competitive edge, both for building audience and maybe also for finding stories as well. And I think that really, really helps people who were in roles like me to be able to show, it's not just this. It's not just the geeky young girl in the corner telling you that this is important. There are people who have had similar careers to you or are working in similar roles to you that are finding a benefit from this. And that was always way more effective as a way of demonstrating the benefits of change than it was me just theorizing why this was going to be such a pivotal change in the way that journalists were doing their work. So I think I learned as much from where I couldn't move forward as where I did. So I remember in terms of a really sort of significant moment was when we launched Guardian Witness, and there was a lot of questions of would people submit user-generated content directly to a newspaper in this way when social media platforms were so much easier to post to. And within the first week, we were getting some pretty intense and impactful user-generated content. I think we got an eyewitness from the stabbing in Woolwich. I don't know if you remember that. There was a stabbing on a bus that was sent directly to The Guardian. And I think that was a really big moment, realizing that actually we had produced something that could be incredibly useful both to the newsroom and to the platform in general. So that was really exciting. Sometimes victories were small. I remember realizing that one of the things that caused a lot of thrash within the organization was when people took out senior members of staff, people from tech companies took out senior members of staff for dinner and made them feel concerned that they weren't using that person's tech platform well enough. And it used to cause a lot of anxiety. And I remember people coming in and sort of coming over to my desk and say, what's our strategy for platform X? Or why aren't we using platform Y more? Or have you seen what this newspaper is doing with platform A? And I remember realizing that there was a real need to combat that thrash in order for us to progress. And I got to the point where I used to write out a little briefing of these are the things that you've probably been asked to do by platform A, and these are the reasons why we're not doing it. But these are the things we are doing with platform A because we know that it's going to help us in this way and this way and this way. I did that for a couple of the tech companies at the time, and that really, really helped me. And I know that sounds like such a strange thing to count as a small victory, but just being able to bring that clarity and then repeat it to stop the sort of constant fear that we were missing out in some way, shape, or form was really useful because it helped people kind of focus on developing the things that mattered. And then I think you move from a newsroom where everyone's really focused on the news, first and foremost. There's if you're in the middle of a newsroom, you've definitely signed up to caring about, making sure that people understand the news and see the news or are engaged in it, and you're very engaged in it yourself. And that's not always true of everyone else in the world. So being able to see that from the outside of a newsroom was a big surprise. More of a surprise than it should have been, I think. And then again, if I thought that The Guardian had turned the treadmill up to 11, I was on to about 16 by the time I moved to Twitter, in the way that people were thinking, the way that the way that people wanted to be entrepreneurial, wanted to be experimental, wanted to try new things, was really, really exciting. And it was incredibly refreshing, I think, to be in an organization where I was starting to realize that my job was to advocate for journalism and not to advocate for digital technologies. I think that I didn't embrace digital technologies because that was the most important interest that I had. Like, I always did it because I thought it was a route, an important route to get people's stories out. And so being given that opportunity to stop having to advocate for the technology and start advocating for the stories was really good for me. It's something that I enjoy much more. And I hadn't anticipated that to be a part of it. I joined Twitter because after I hadn't intended to join Twitter, but having been given the opportunity to come and find out more about them and the work of a partnership manager, I suddenly realized it gave me this great opportunity to stick my nose into every newsroom in the UK. And that was that felt like a luxury. Like, there's not many roles, given the competitiveness of UK media, where you can do that. So that was pretty exciting, and it helped me to understand, I was not alone when it came to some of the things that I thought were problems that I was suffering from when it came to digital change. So that was very useful. It helped me to understand where we were as an industry rather than just individual publications when it came to thinking about digital and how different people were and at different stages they were at, and how their organizations got in the way of them in different ways or supported them in different ways as well. There was a recent study by LinkedIn that started to look at, as more traditional roles declined within journalism and media as a whole, looking at where new roles were sort of starting to pop up. And I think there are a lot of different opportunities now for people in journalism, but in sort of journalism adjacent roles, I guess. So I guess you would call my role journalism adjacent. In terms of, are those roles going to be suited to you? Is that something that you might want to follow? I guess my 3 bits of advice are: 1, ask yourself what really keeps you getting up and going to work every single day in a newsroom. Because I think we all assume that everyone's there for the same reasons, but they're really not. Some people are there for the writing, the ability to control how to tell a story. Other people are there for other reasons. I was there because I enjoyed being part of connecting other people's stories with the world, but I didn't necessarily need or want to do that writing myself. Other people are there because they enjoy the pace of it, the challenge of it. Some enjoy the political wranglings. There's all sorts of different reasons why you're in a newsroom, and understanding yours is really important for deciding when to take the next step. Then I would say, go talk to people, because jobs are starting to appear all the time that have never really been there before. You think about products such as Data Miner, the breaking news detection tool, and some of the people that work there helping to improve the algorithms or think about breaking news detection and how that works. I mean, that's, if you're interested in product and development, like, that is potentially a really interesting avenue to you. Or maybe, you enjoy relationship building, and you might want to talk to people who work in partnership management within other organizations as well. So go talk to as many people as you can in as many different jobs, because tech, again, is not homogenous. There's a wide variety of different things that you can do that you might find out actually cater for the thing you love most of all. And then third is, I think, once you know what gets you to work every morning, stop listening to the part of your brain that worries about what other people think. I think I spent a lot of time worrying about the fact that I was going to walk out of journalism and I wasn't going to be a journalist anymore. And I'd spent all my life wanting to be a journalist and wanting to be part of that club. And so that was the biggest barrier to moving out and into tech. And it's the thing I worry least about these days. It's just not on my radar because I was very lucky that I've ended up in a position that completely caters to the things I care about the most and want to be able to help solve for technology, sure, but importantly for journalism. The best thing about my role is how incredibly exciting the challenges are and how incredibly global and diverse and interesting the people are that I work with to try and solve those challenges. And some of the less good things come from how big the challenges are and how incredibly diverse and different the team of people are that come together to solve those challenges. And I wouldn't have it any other way.
So thanks so much to Joanna Geary for giving me so much of her time and taking me through her career. I hope you'd agree it was absolutely fascinating and a really great reflection of how the news industry has dealt with the internet over the past nearly 2 decades. It's been a time of change. Well, that's it for another episode of Freelance Pod. If you enjoyed what we talked about in this episode, please do get involved on social. You can find Freelance Pod on Instagram as @freelancepod, on Twitter as @freelance_pod_. There's a Facebook group called Freelance Pod, and you can also sign up for the newsletter. The URL is in the show notes. Don't forget that the success of this podcast relies on you, the listeners. If you do enjoy it, please do rate, review and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, also known as iTunes. This means that other listeners will find out that this podcast exists and they'll come and join us too. That's it for now. Speak to you again soon. Goodbye.